Okay, so I want to thank Em for inviting me to speak, and also I want to thank the Rockland Public Library, and I want to thank you guys for coming out on a drizzly night and listening to me. So tonight we're going to ask a question: what did it mean to live in a so-called free state like Maine during the 19th century? We're going to talk about life from the perspectives of two families from Maine. These are actual families, one white and one black. The Gordons and the Rubies of Portland were neighbors. They were contemporaries. They attended church and school together, but they were worlds apart, separated by their political beliefs, their family cultures, and their race. So the 19th century was a pretty turbulent time across the United States, and slavery was behind a good deal of the unrest. And this is actually an image here of a pro-slavery riot, if you can believe it, in 1837, not in Maine, but in another free state, Illinois. And at this riot, Elijah Lovejoy of Maine was killed for publishing an abolitionist newspaper. But let's keep the focus on Maine for now. These are federal census statistics on our African American population over time. And you can see that our black population never reached 1% until recently. And because we've traditionally been such a white state, it's been, I think, an excuse to write off our black history and to assume that our small African American communities have had little impact, or that white Mainers had limited knowledge of people of African heritage, or they didn't really understand slavery. I'm hoping to change those perceptions tonight. So Maine's maritime trade, it was its main economic engine, obviously, in the 19th century. And the maritime trade was well integrated, as was the nation's. Blacks comprised 1 of every 5 U.S. merchant sailors in the 19th century. And throughout the first 3/4 of the 19th century, black stevedores controlled the Portland docks. So no ships, crews, nor passengers could leave or enter Portland without encountering people of African heritage. Now, I just did a quick look at the 1850 census for Rockland and Thomaston. And I noted that there were about 20 people living in Rockland and Thomaston, people of African descent in 1850. And I'm willing to bet that sort of the vast majority of the heads of household in those families worked in the maritime trade in one way or another. So, of course, we all know that Maine was a so-called free state, right, during most of the 19th century. But of course, slavery existed here, as it did in virtually all of the original 13 colonies at one time or another. And these are some examples of slavery in Maine. In 1663, 2 Africans enslaved by Captain Brian Pendleton of Saco died in a fire, and an inquest was held. Now, this case appears in Maine's earliest court records, and what it tells us is that people of African descent have inhabited Maine, or the Wabanaki Dawnland, virtually as long as those of European descent have. Now, the wealthy Shapley family in York County enslaved quite a few individuals, including an African man whom they named Will. So Will was eventually freed, and his son Black Will, or William Black Jr., was the first non-native settler on what is now Bailey Island. In fact, the island was once known as Will's Island, and you can see that the strait between it and Orr's Island there is still named Will's Gut. What's also interesting is that Will's direct descendants, the blacks, still live on Orr's Island. In the 1780s, Parson McLean of Bristol enslaved a young black girl, and he sent her out to fetch in his cows on a cold wintry night. Now, she came back saying she couldn't find the cows, so he sent her back out again. And the next day she was found, frozen to death, lying beside a fence. This anecdote comes to us from the history of the towns of Bristol and Bremen, but it doesn't bother to mention the girl's name. So 1783 was a really, really important year in New England and throughout the states. Of course, in September, the American Revolution officially ended with the Treaty of Paris. And slavery was challenged in 1783 in Massachusetts and thus in Maine, which of course we were a district of Massachusetts at the time. So how did slavery end? Well, you might think that enlightened white legislators saw fit to overturn laws permitting slavery. And that's not what happened. Okay? Slavery was declared unlawful because 3 enslaved persons took their cases to court and won. Now, Elizabeth Freeman, pictured here, was one of those. She heard her enslaver, John Ashley, discussing the new Massachusetts Constitution, which was written by John Adams, by the way, which said, quote, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. Of course, it echoes the Declaration of Independence, right? As many of the northern states' constitutions did. Well, Elizabeth Freeman was illiterate. Nevertheless, she believed that the phrase, all men are born free and equal, pertained to her, and a court agreed with her. Around the same time, a man named Quock Walker also sued his enslaver and won, the judge writing in his notes that, quote, there can be no perpetual servitude of a rational creature. So as a result of these trials, enslaved persons began to walk away from bondage or sue for freedom. And the 1790 census, which is the first U.S. census, it's here on the right. If you look, what do you note in the columns next to Maine and Massachusetts? Yeah, there are none. There are supposedly no slaves here at all. I think that's somewhat deceptive. I think it's fair to say that a few enslaved persons could still be found in Maine after that date, but clearly it was on its way out as a practice. So in December of 1783, this very, very important year, 2 formerly enslaved persons, Boston Ruby and Zeruiah Lewis, were married in New Gloucester, Maine. And they're important because we're going to discuss their descendants, who became activists for abolition and civil rights. Now, we don't know the backgrounds of either one, but this couple, they both appear in Maine's marriage records and in the earliest censuses. And actually, I know of at least one of their descendants who still lives here in Maine. Now, they're married in 1783, but by 1800, we find the Rubies in the town of Gray, Maine, which is the next town to New Gloucester where they were married. And so Gray is the green square there, and New Gloucester is up to the northeast of it. Now their children, Reuben Ruby and his 4 siblings, were among the first generation of African Americans born free in Maine. In addition to the Rubies, there were some 17 other people of color living in Gray at this time. The question is, what were these black families doing in Gray, right? Gray was rural farmland, and in fact still is to some degree, so they could have performed agricultural work. But in 1792, Samuel Mayall established the first water-powered woolen mill in North America on Collier Brook in Gray. And that's the picture that you see. This is an old postcard of the mill on the right. And actually, it's where that red dot is on the map. So I think it's very possible that these black families probably found employment at the mill, either helping to maintain the buildings, shearing, carding, or spinning the wool, or raising the sheep, or what have you. And in fact, as I look at that red dot, it almost kind of like beckons people to move from Gray into New Gloucester, because of course in those days you could not commute, right? You had to live nearby your place of employment. So Reuben Ruby and his 4 siblings were born free in Maine. But how free were they? 5 years after the court cases in Massachusetts declared slavery unlawful, the legislature found it necessary to pass a law preventing those of African heritage from being, quote, privately carried off by force or decoyed away with probable intent of being sold as slaves. So blacks were being kidnapped in the North, shipped south, and sold. And this was a very common practice throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, known as the reverse Underground Railroad. Maybe some of you have seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. Yeah, about Solomon Northrop, who was a free black musician living in upstate New York. He was lured away from his house with the promise of a job, and they got him away from his home and kidnapped him, and he was sold south and was forced to work forced to be enslaved for 12 years. He wrote a book about his experiences, and the book was a huge bestseller in the United States. Nevertheless, he was the tip of the iceberg. Okay, many adults and children during this time were kidnapped and sold south. And even if perpetual slavery was outlawed in Maine, servitude was not. So if you look on the right here, this is a notice about a runaway servant in the Portland Gazette, and it's from 1802, 19 years after slavery was declared unlawful. And you'll note that the physical attributes of the so-called servant girl are mentioned, as is her clothing. And people are said, if you find her, you should lodge her in prison. Okay? But what's missing from this notice? Her name. There's no name associated with her whatsoever. Okay? So you're beginning to see a pattern here. I think in one sense, leaving people's names out of the historical record is a way of sort of making them disappear. Okay. And this notice echoes thousands of runaway notices that were printed in the South and in the border states during this time, seeking to recover runaways from slavery. But here it is in a Maine newspaper. So in Maine and Massachusetts, black individuals were free to marry. They could have children who were free. They could work for themselves or others. They could own property. But they faced segregation and discrimination in housing, schools and churches, ships and stagecoaches, public houses and inns. They had only limited freedom of movement. Settling in many states was forbidden, and Massachusetts actually prohibited blacks who were not citizens from staying longer than 2 months. In 1800, Boston selectmen warned 239 free blacks that they must leave. So, who was Reuben Ruby? Well, we talked about his being born in Gray to two formerly enslaved parents. But as a child of 6 or 7, he moved to Portland. And he did so when his widowed mother, Zeruiah, married a man named John Lake. Now, Zeruiah and her children were black, but John Lake and his 2 children were white. And although the laws of Massachusetts forbade interracial marriage at the time, plenty such marriages like this occurred. Okay. Perhaps because his parents had been enslaved, Ruby became one of Maine's most prominent activists, working locally and nationally to bring an end to slavery. He was the first hack driver in Portland. A hack driver is a term for a coach, a hackney coach, and he was like a cab driver. He owned a coach, and he would drive people back and forth around Portland. He was also an operative on Maine's Underground Railroad. And if you look at his advertisement, if you can see it, you can see that it says he lives on Preble Street, where he may be found at any time in the night. Okay, so that's, obviously code language for saying if you need to stay hidden, come to me, right? Ruby and several of his African-American neighbors founded the Abyssinian Religious Society and Meeting House, there on the left. It's actually built on Reuben Ruby's former property in Portland, and it's the 3rd oldest standing African-American church in the nation. He helped to found the Maine Anti-Slavery Society. He was elected president of the 1835 National Negro Convention. He was a good friend of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, ran a restaurant in New York City, was president of the Manhattan Anti-Slavery Society, and was a 49er, traveling to California and coming back with several $1,000s worth of gold in 1850. I think it's an incredible resume for someone born to formerly enslaved parents in Gray, Maine. Now, his sons, too, were illustrious citizens. One of them was one of the first 2 African Americans to be elected to the Texas State Senate. Now, growing up in Portland, I never heard a word about Reuben Ruby. I didn't hear about it in the schools. I didn't hear about it from my parents, from neighbors, from no one. Okay. Today, though, Portland's Freedom Trail has erected a plaque at the site of Reuben Ruby's hack stand. So, Reuben Ruby grew up with 2 white brothers from the Gordon family. Nathaniel II and his brother William were about the same age as Reuben Ruby, about within 11 months of his age. brothers Joshua and Morgan Gordon were a bit older. Now, this whole family became shipmasters and merchants. And you can see the newspaper ad here on the right. That's an actual ad for William Gordon's store in Portland, which sold West Indian goods that his brother and others carried to Maine from the Caribbean. Now, the West Indian trade, as it was called, was very lucrative for Maine, including places like Rockland. We exported lumber, dried codfish and ice, and imported sugar, molasses, coffee, liquor, and cigars. And most of the products imported, especially the sugar and molasses, were produced by enslaved persons laboring on large plantations in the heat of the Caribbean sun. So this is a map, a partial map of Portland's East End in the 1820s and 30s. And you can see that the Rubies likely lived only a couple blocks away from the Gordons during their childhoods. So again, just keep in mind that the map covers a couple of decades. But if you look up here, you can see Joshua Gordon's home on Smith Street. Okay, that borders what was then the African American neighborhood, which went from, let's say, Congress Street. It was bordered on one side by Mount Joy or Munjoy Hill, and Hampshire Street on the other side, and the waterfront. And in this neighborhood, between 400 and 800 people of African descent lived. And the vast majority of the men, as I said, were either sailors or they worked on Portland's docks. So Reuben Ruby, when he was living in Portland, lived most of his life in this neighborhood. Before the 1830s, both white and black children attended school together. So I think it's highly likely that the Gordons and Rubies both attended the North School, which you can see there on the corner of Congress and King Street. Okay. We know for a fact that they attended the same church, which was Portland's Second Congregational down on Middle Street, closer to the waterfront. But the black families at the Second Congregational were forced to sit in the balconies and in the far reaches of the building. They could not vote in church matters, and they were often subject to verbal abuse, and they felt very unwelcome. So they appealed to the state to start their own church, the Abyssinian, and the state said yes. So the Abyssinian Meeting House is still with us, and it's an important reminder of our small but very outspoken black community. Now, when Reuben Ruby and Nathaniel Gordon II were 22 and 21 years old, Maine petitioned to become a state. And this caused tremendous turmoil in the country and the Congress because of the potential imbalance of free to so-called slave states. It's really hard right now to think about how contentious this really was and how scared people were by this issue, but they were very scared. And if you don't believe me, just look at Thomas Jefferson's quote. He says, "This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union." So he assumes that this is going to be the end of the country that he's helped to found. As you probably know, Henry Clay persuaded many in Congress to vote for the Missouri Compromise. The result, Maine entered the Union as a free state, but in doing so, facilitated the entrance of another slave state, Missouri. Now, Mainers were very divided over this compromise. We had 7 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives at the time. Now we have 2. Okay, so we had a lot more influence back in the day. Now, of those 7 members, 5 members voted against the compromise, not because they didn't want statehood, but because they were against the expansion of slavery. 2 members voted for it, putting the vote over the top at 90-87. So the Missouri Compromise passed by 3 votes, and 2 of those came from Maine. And these 2 statements from the Portland newspapers, I think, show just how divided both Portland and Mainers were on the issue. If you look at the Gazette, it says, "The labor is over. The mother is delivered. Maine has come into the world with a twin sister, black as Erebus, deformed as sin, and ugly as Satan." That's the Gazette's impression of Missouri right? If you look at the more conservative Eastern Argus, which I think became the Press Herald, by the way, it's a whole different story. Perhaps we're not disposed to examine so critically as we ought into the means by which this glorious and happy result has been effected. But we don't regret that Missouri has precisely the same rights as we've always claimed, that of managing her own concerns in her own way. And here are the basics of the two state constitutions. So Maine outlawed slavery and authorized African American men to vote. And Missouri said that the legislature could never outlaw slavery, and free African Americans could not only not vote, they couldn't even enter the state. So they're widely divergent, right? So states had plenty of leeway in how they would treat slavery and free black citizens. But as a result of being able to vote, because he was a Maine citizen, Reuben Ruby joined the Whig Party in Maine and became politically active. He was one of very, very few blacks in the nation at the time who could vote. Even many so-called free states found ways of abridging blacks' voting rights. And I'll give you an example. New York, which of course was a free state, required blacks to own $250 worth of property in order to vote. That's about $9,000 today, while whites had no such requirements. Okay? As a result, in 1835, New York City had a black population of some 16,000, but only 68 registered voters. Okay, so talk about voter suppression. There you have it. When he lived in New York City, as he did for several years, Reuben Ruby actually took petitions door to door to try and overturn that requirement. Now, along with the Missouri Compromise came the Piracy Act of 1820. And it declared that Americans carrying Africans to any other nation to be enslaved was piracy. And it called for the death penalty. Now, there have been laws against the slave trade since the Slave Trade Act of 1794, signed by George Washington. But the 1820 law made it a capital offense to transport kidnapped individuals into slavery. Unfortunately, you could still carry enslaved persons from one state to another. But my question is, why would Southern legislators, most of them slave owners, agree to a law that prescribes the death penalty for carrying Africans into slavery? Well, the disturbing answer is that, of course, it made enslaved people in the United States all the more valuable. If you cut into the supply, then they become worth more, which means enslavers could get much, much more for their investments in human trafficking. Now, this image here on the right is probably the most widely circulated image on the slave trade ever. And it was created in 1787 by Thomas Clarkson, an English abolitionist. And it shows an actual slave ship, the Brooks, with 454 people crammed onto 4 so-called slave decks that you can see in the cutaway. The Brooks sailed from Liverpool to the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean, where its captives were deposited. And at this point, it's important to remember, so it was an English ship, it's important to remember that Great Britain was the second largest carrier of enslaved people in the world. Does anybody want to guess who was number 1? I'll tell you. Portugal was number 1. Britain was number 2. Spain, France, Holland, the United States and Denmark tied for 6th. Okay? So this is really important because we have to think of this as a global enterprise, because that's what it was. It's not just one person, one ship's captain, one ship, one community, one nation, right? Most of these were large slave trading syndicates, international syndicates, and they hired up, Yankee shipmasters and Yankee ships to sort of do their bidding. Now, if you think slavery was not a contentious topic in Maine because we're too far north or our black population was too small, this list of anti-abolition riots might change your mind. In 1834, abolitionist C.C. Cone spoke in Bath, and a mob broke down the doors and smashed the windows of the building where he was speaking. The attendees had to run for their lives, and the local newspaper announced that, quote, such an assemblage would not be tolerated in the loyal city of Bath. In 1835, Reuben Ruby called publicly for immediate emancipation of everybody, and a threatening notice was posted against him on the post office door in Portland. Then anti-abolitionists called a meeting to express their outrage at his statement and the idea of immediate emancipation. 100 people attended and signed a petition, including Ruby's neighbor, Morgan Gordon. In 1840, Thomaston officials forbade any anti-slavery meetings in churches, houses, or in the streets. In 1842, the Reverend Austin Willey was speaking in Damariscotta when a mob broke into the building and rushed the stage. Willey had to flee, and he said, the village resounded as with the yells of demons. That's Damariscotta. I mean, there's not even 2,000 people living in Damariscotta. In 1847, Frederick Douglass and Charles Lennox Reman, very famous abolitionists, were speaking at the Friends Meeting House in Portland and were stoned. The Women's Anti-Slavery Sewing Circle had to form a bodyguard around the speakers so that they could leave without being injured. But Maine also had a vibrant Underground Railroad. And here are two known safe houses. At the top is the Stowe House in Brunswick, where Harriet Beecher Stowe harbored John Andrew Jackson, who had escaped from South Carolina and who eventually went on to write a book about his experiences. And down here in the lower right is the Dennett House on Spring Street in Portland. That's where Lydia Dennett harbored two very famous fugitives, William and Ellen Craft, who escaped from Macon, Georgia by a very clever scheme. Ellen was light-skinned, and she pretended to be a man who was sickly and traveling north for medical treatment. William, her husband, pretended to be her slave. Now, Ellen pretended to have an injured right arm and poor eyesight because neither she nor her husband could read nor write. And they wanted to avoid having to sign ship and rooming house registers on their way north. Their book, here it is, here's the frontispiece, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, was published in London in 1860. And again, it was an utter sensation. It was a very, very popular book. And actually, you can see that's a portrait of Ellen in her getup. She's dressed as a man, she's wearing dark glasses, and she has a sling for her arm. Of course, the vast majority of fugitives who passed through Maine did not write books. They were anonymous and unseen because of the very high cost of becoming known, both for them and for the people who harbored them. And the last bullet here is, are some families that we know were involved in the Underground Railroad in Portland, including the first four, Ruby, Freeman, Manuel, Pierre, who were black, and the rest, Fessenden, Winslow, Thomas, Dow, Dennett, and Hussey, who were white. Now we know that these families worked closely together and collaborated all the time. Now, the 1850s were a disastrous decade for African Americans. California was admitted to the Union as a free state through compromise, much as Maine was. And part of that compromise included the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that all American citizens had to help capture fugitives from slavery. If you failed to report someone who might be a fugitive, you could be jailed for 6 months and fined $1,000. Or if you harbored somebody, the same deal. And black persons assumed to be fugitives were not given due process. They were to be judged by a commissioner. And commissioners got $5 for each person declared free and $10 for each person remanded to slavery. Sounds fair, right? Commissioners were actually given a financial incentive to declare that individuals were fugitives. Now, this law was protested throughout the North. Portland created a vigilance committee to warn of slave catchers coming into the town and to protect fugitives. And of course, Reuben Ruby was on that committee. But Maine resisted too. The state legislature declared that local courts couldn't be used to enforce the fugitive slave law, and that county prosecutors had to offer their services to persons declared fugitives at no cost. Okay? It's very similar to some of the things that are going on today with whether local law enforcement is going to collaborate with ICE or they're not going to collaborate with ICE, for example. Now, as if the fugitive slave law weren't bad enough, the Dred Scott decision was handed down in 1857, and it's widely agreed to be the worst Supreme Court decision of all time. It declared that African Americans, free or in bondage, born in the United States or elsewhere, were not citizens, and as such had no rights. So despite being born in Gray, Maine, Reuben Ruby, at age 58, was suddenly declared a non-citizen with no rights under the Constitution. Put yourself in his shoes. This is why a decade later, the 14th Amendment in 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, guaranteeing citizenship to everyone born in the United States. Because in 1857, an arm of the US government declared an entire class of people non-citizens, whether they were born here or not. And the lesson reverberates today. If that can happen, if an arm of the government can suddenly just declare a whole bunch of people non-citizens, or if there is no birthright citizenship, then who among us is a citizen, and what makes us a citizen? I'll also add that the 14th Amendment guarantees due process. That's something that the fugitives were denied by the Compromise of 1850. And that's another issue that's front and center today. The 14th Amendment states, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So note that it doesn't say citizens. It says any person within its jurisdiction. At any rate, in the meantime, before the 14th Amendment was ratified, the Dred Scott ruling undermined the Maine Constitution. So the Maine Supreme Court had to meet, and they determined that under Maine law, African Americans were bona fide citizens and could not be denied the vote. The fact that citizens and state governments refused to obey federal laws at this time, I think, shows a nation that was coming apart at the seams. And in many ways, it was the North pulling away from the South. So I want to talk a little more about the Gordons and about Maine's involvement in the slave trade. Now, these are two notorious slave traders from Maine. Of course, there were many more, okay, but these guys were well known, and their exploits were covered widely in 19th century newspapers. Gordon III, I've spoken previously about Gordon II, so unfortunately there were at least four generations of Nathaniels in this family. So sometimes Gordon III was called Gordon Jr., and he's often confused with his father, who was the contemporary of Reuben Ruby. But so I've given him the number 3 to try and keep those generations straight. Before I talk about him, though, let me just mention his father and uncle, because both were sea captains, and both were implicated in carrying kidnapped Africans into slavery. His father was arrested in 1838 for bringing an enslaved man from Guadeloupe into the port of New York. Now, you'll remember that the penalty for doing this was death. Gordon II was arrested, and his ship was seized. But a grand jury failed to indict him when the New York district attorney simply never showed up. So Gordon went free. Now, this was really typical of trials held in the Southern District of New York. The courts were corrupt, and they reflected the mercantile interests of the city, which was the main port for the United States, particularly for sugar and for cotton. Now, Nathaniel Gordon II's brother and Gordon III's uncle, Morgan Gordon, made at least one successful trip from Africa to Cuba in 1843 with 346 captives. I could find no evidence of other trips, but I think it's highly likely that he made more. And the reason I think that is because customs officials and even journalists were suspicious of him long before that date. And you can see it in their writings, whether we're looking in newspapers or letters or things like that, notes. And the last 4 bullet points are the trips we know Nathaniel Gordon III made. destroying or severely altering the lives of nearly 3,000 Africans. He stole the brig Camargo, which, by the way, was built in Damariscotta, and instead of sailing it from San Francisco to New York, as the owner hired him to do, he sailed to Rio de Janeiro, and from there to Africa, and back to Brazil, unloaded his captives, and burned the ship. Okay, this guy is a real pirate. Interestingly, just a few months ago, in December, divers and archaeologists with the Slave Wrecks Project identified the burned and sunken wreck of the Camargo in the waters off Brazil. And I spoke with them earlier this spring, and they told me that there's actually going to be a movie made of that effort, so be looking for that. That, in fact, was the last, supposedly the last trip of enslaved persons into Brazil. On Gordon's last trip, his ship, the Erie, was stopped in the Congo River by the American Anti-Slavery Squadron, and Gordon was arrested. So the United States and Great Britain had what they called Africa squadrons, which were Navy ships that were intended to enforce both nations' laws prohibiting the transatlantic slave trade. So in 1860, as we said, Gordon was captured red-handed in the Congo River by the U.S. Navy. He was then brought to New York to stand trial in a federal court. Typical of the times, his first trial resulted in a hung jury. But his second trial resulted in a guilty verdict, and he was sentenced to death. Now, this was a momentous reversal for New York federal courts. It was the only such result in U.S. history. Only one other slave captain had been convicted in 1857, but that verdict was overturned on a technicality. Now, it's worth remembering that we're talking about 1860, 1861 here. That's 40 years after the toughest law against the slave trade was passed, and there's almost no cases in between where they're doing anything about this. Anyway, Gordon is declared guilty. 18,000 citizens from Maine and 11,000 from New York signed petitions asking President Lincoln to commute Gordon's sentence to life in prison. But Lincoln refused, and you can see that that's his statement there, and you can see that he admonishes the prisoner to relinquish all expectation of pardon by human authority. So this was a sensational story in the press for the 2 years it took to convict Gordon. The bottom drawing from Harper's Weekly is a contemporary drawing of his execution in New York, and actually Gordon is the short fellow there in the middle of the photo on the scaffolding. Now, everyone believes that being a slave captain was lucrative, and that's why people did it. And for some it was, especially the ship owners, okay, and the big bosses. But despite at least 3 successful trips carrying kidnapped Africans whom he sold into slavery, Gordon was penniless at his death. And on the top right is an advertisement in the New York Herald for a fundraiser. This is after his execution, a fundraiser to help support his widow and orphan child, and it features clowns and circus acts. So just to prove that the Gordons were not outliers or anomalies, let me tell you about Timothy Mayer. He's from Whitefield, Maine. I don't know if you folks know where Whitefield is, but essentially if it's between, well, it's inland from Wiscasset and Damariscotta, not very far. So the black dot on this map is where Mayer was raised, and his father and mother had actually immigrated to Whitefield from Ireland. Now, in 1835, when he was in his 20s, Timothy Mayer and several of his brothers moved from Whitefield to Mobile, Alabama to seek their fortunes. By the eve of the Civil War, Mayer owned a large plantation, a lumber mill, and several steamboats that plied Mobile Bay. And when someone said that the Act of 1820 had made it impossible to smuggle enslaved persons into the United States, Mayer laughed, and he bet them $1,000 that he could do it. So he purchased the schooner Clotilda. He hired a ship captain named William Foster, who brought 110 captives from present-day Benin and Nigeria into Mobile Bay in July of 1860. This is about a month before Gordon is captured. They hid the captives in the cane brakes, and Foster had the flotilla burned in a remote part of the bay. It wasn't discovered until 2019, and those are actual sonar images of the discovery of the flotilla in Mobile Bay. Now, Mayer and his brothers and friends enslaved a number of the captives, and they sold the others. Everyone knew that he'd done this, okay? The local press reported it. So Mayer was charged in a federal court with bringing individuals into the United States intended for slavery, the penalty for which was death. But the federal judge in his district, William Jones, was Mayer's friend. And Mayer had named one of his steamboats after Judge Jones. So you're going to be surprised to learn that Judge Jones declared that no kidnapped Africans could be found in his district. Mayer was acquitted. As you can see, justice was meted out very, very unevenly in the 1850s and 60s, and it's another sign that the country was breaking apart. So now I just want to summarize the two families for you, the two main families that we've talked about, the Rubys and the Gordons. And I think they demonstrate that not only that Maine was divided, like the nation as a whole, but also that social and political values run in families. I think this top photo is an image of Reuben Ruby. I've already talked enough about his activism. What I didn't tell you was that his wives, Rachel and Jeanette, and his sister Sophia, were anti-slavery activists in their own rights. And I believe Sophia's grave in Eastern Cemetery in Portland is on the Freedom Trail, actually. His son, William, in the second photo, right in the middle of the first row, that's when he was a member of the Portland Fire Department. Before he was a member of the Portland Fire Department, he saved the Abyssinian Meeting House from the Great Portland Fire of 1866 by climbing up on the roof and covering it with wet blankets. That's why that National Historic Landmark is still with us today. He was also involved in the Maine Republican Party and the Negro Convention movement. Son George, the lower left, went south during Reconstruction to teach freedmen and women how to read and write, and he became one of the first two African Americans elected to the Texas State Senate. Son Horatio, lower right, also went south and became a leader of the Exodusters, African Americans who left southern states for the north and west to escape the terrorism against them after the collapse of Reconstruction and the start of Jim Crow. Now, the Gordons, too, suggest that political beliefs, values, and behaviors are also passed down through families, since at least 3 members of this family were implicated in the illegal transatlantic slave trade. I'm not going to go back over their exploits, but they're listed here. I just want to add that Morgan Gordon's son, George, a cousin to Nathaniel III, was also born and raised in Portland and became a blockade runner for the Confederacy during the Civil War. So a strong streak of defiance ran through this Yankee family from Portland, Maine. Well, what about Maine itself? As a so-called free state, Maine was full of contradictions. A large proportion of ships used in the slave trade were built in Maine because we led the nation in building wooden ships. Now, in fact, in Rockland, I know there are 3 confirmed slave ships that were built here. The Francis Ellen, the Lewis McLean, and the Triton. And actually, there's another one from Owl's Head called the Newsboy. Okay, this is because we were the main supplier of wooden ships for the entire nation at the time. Maine also produced several of the most notorious slave captains of the 19th century. Its maritime trade was built upon sugar and molasses produced by enslaved laborers in the Caribbean. And Maine citizens were divided over slavery and emancipation. The battles that were being fought between North and South were also being fought between neighbors right here in this state. There is some good news, though. And that is that in a couple of ways, very important ways, Maine was the leading edge for modeling equal rights. As long as Maine was a state, black men were always allowed to vote here, and that right was never abridged. We're one of only 4 states that never abridged or rescinded black men's voting rights. Would anybody like to guess what the other 3 might be? New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. Okay? And when the U.S. Supreme Court declared that African Americans were not citizens and had, quote, no rights that the white man is bound to respect, Maine Supreme Court responded with this answer. The people of Maine, in exercise of their sovereign power, have conferred citizenship upon those of African descent. Having the required qualifications, they are entitled to vote. So we've talked a lot about individual resistance, but the states, too, have often effectively resisted the federal government and guided it in the right direction. And in 1857, the Maine Supreme Court stood up to the U.S. Supreme Court, saying, we disagree with the Dred Scott decision. We have our own laws regarding African Americans. So the states' rights argument can cut both ways, and sometimes that can be a good thing. But at the very least, it's another one of the critical checks and balances built into our system of government. So there's one more bit of good news, and that is that my talk is over. And I hope I didn't drone on too long. If you like it, I hope you'll purchase my book here on the right. It's available at all those places. And thank you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. I'll take questions if you need. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, in the back, far back. Yeah, yeah. You mean, for example, the traffickers? Well, no, they didn't have as much political power. And as I said, the South was intent upon, so only 300, only, I don't say only, but 388,000 people were brought into the United States. It's important to compare that with Cuba, 600,000 people brought to Cuba. And we'll compare it with Brazil, between 4.5 and 5.5 million people. So that law, those laws were somewhat effective. And really what they are is they're playing with, unfortunately, they are playing with the market and trying to make their so-called property much more valuable. It's sad but true. And George Washington was one of those who, I mean, he signed the 1794 law against the slave trade. It wasn't as severe as the later laws, but still there were efforts in the United States to stop that trade. And some of them were sort of effective. If you look later on in the century, so if you look at Gordon and you look at Mayer and others, so Mayer's bringing the last known shipload of enslaved persons into the United States. But Gordon and all of the other bad guys, shall we say, were bringing people to Cuba and to Brazil because those markets were still open. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Well, I think, well, so it was like 18,000 from Maine and 11,000 from New York, I believe. And you can see those petitions. They're still on file at the National Archives, and you can see people's names. I saw one page, for example, from Brunswick. I'm sure those people didn't know him well, but I recognize some of the family names because my family happens to be from the islands in that area. I think the motivations were many. I think there were some people who were against the death penalty. I think there were some people who didn't. I mean, obviously, the United States didn't take this law all that seriously for about 40 years. And people just couldn't conceive of putting someone to death for this. Well, you know, it's until we get to Lincoln, finally, who did it. So I think there were a lot of different motivations. I think that a lot of slave captains, even though they were captured red-handed, they got off via technicalities, they were pardoned. I'll tell you, there were at least 6 or 7 presidents, starting with Jefferson and all the way through, I believe, Grant, who pardoned convicted slave traffickers. So, you know, we just didn't seem to have the political will to carry through these laws, I think. That's my best guess, yeah. Other questions? Yes. Yep. Yeah. I'm sure it could have been. It wasn't. I mean, it was, so really what's going on at that period of time, as you saw from when I mentioned the state constitutions, and Missouri and Maine having very different attitudes and practices toward African Americans, either free or enslaved. The country is really allowing states to have a lot more leeway. And they've since obviously tightened up quite a bit. But no, they were allowing states to have leeway. And I think, yeah, 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 yeah. It was just, I think, I think everybody, I have to say, many of the people in the North felt that it was a ridiculous ruling. If you look at the newspapers in the South, of course, say, oh, it's great, and abolitionists now have really been, you know, they really stuck it to them. And if you look at the newspapers in the North, they say this is ridiculous. And even Frederick Douglass came to Maine and lectured on it, and he said, I have no fear that such a thin tissue of lies as this decision will last very long. So he was not even really threatened by it. I think he felt that this was the declaration of war in a way, and I think he was kind of right. Yeah. So, other questions? Yes. Yes, it was. Yeah, those 4. In 59, I'm really not sure. Yeah, I'm really not sure. There was that famous case in the South, and I think that was, yes, and yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's iffy, right? Yeah, yeah. Well, and so here's the thing, that the law didn't keep people from marrying. Let's be honest about it. As I said, Reuben Ruby's mother married a white man after after her first husband died. And it was declared illegal in Maine and Massachusetts, but does anybody know Bob Green, who's a historian of Black history here in Maine? And I asked him, he's done a lot of research in individual families, Black families, and he said it was very common for these families for Blacks and whites to marry. It really was not uncommon. This was part of the problem. I mentioned William Black Jr., who settled Bailey Island. And one of the reasons that he had to go to Bailey Island, he was from York County, way down south. And one of the reasons that he came up to Casco Bay was because he had a white lover. I don't know whether they were married or not, but he was taking a lot of flack in York County. So they moved up to Bailey Island where they could be by themselves and nobody would bother them. So, yeah. Well, as I say, even though there were laws, it didn't stop people from marrying one another. So, yeah, yeah. Other questions? Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I do too. Atlantic Black Box. Yeah. Oh, Vana Carmona. Yeah. Yeah, he's very good. So Atlantic Black Box is like a consortium of both academics and just sort of everyday people, excuse me, who who want to study this and who want to sort of unearth this history that was really kind of lost to us for many decades, many generations actually. So it's a pretty interesting project. And they also talk a lot about indigenous history as well. Yeah, so very cool. Yes. I haven't had to. I haven't had to. I think it, because people come to these talks voluntarily, I think nobody's coming. That's uh, yeah. There's a little backlash, obviously, but the truth is that I think once this history gets out, it's out there. It's really hard to suppress it again. There are things like, I don't know if you guys know about the Slave Voyages database, but it's a free database online that lists the ships, where they were from, who owned them, how many captives were aboard, where did they land, et cetera, et cetera. And it's from all over the world. And it's voluminous. How is anyone ever going to suppress that? How are they going to suppress the images, the sonar images of the Clotilda or the Camargo, where people are diving down and finding that, identifying these ships? They can, and to me, what happens when you start looking into this information is it's not that embarrassing. You find more heroes. You find people like Reuben Ruby, who deserves to be known, was somebody that, as I say, was nobody told me about him. And when I got to know him, I just thought, wow, what a fascinating guy he is. And he's more fascinating than you think, because in addition to doing these things, he was a gardener, and he entered contests in the Maine horological society and the pomological society. He was on the Widows' Wood Committee, meaning that he was on a group of people that, back in the 19th century, if women were widowed, these committees would make sure that they had enough wood for heating and cooking during the winter. so he was on that. He worked to try and get people out of jail who were arrested on specious, grounds. He's just a really interesting fellow, and to me, he deserved to be more broadly known. So, all right, thanks, guys.